Ex-Liquidity, where you find out how not to be fucking exit liquidity.
For our two listeners and whoever ends up listening to the recording, we are doing this episode on Urbit, which, if you're not familiar, personally I think you should be. I have found it to be very not Web3 or, crypto in the sense that most of our followers might see it, but very much complementary and adjacent and its own mountain in its own right. And to kind of help us get through that, we brought on AJ to talk a little about what he's been doing, what he's found interesting, and maybe help explain some concepts that we're still lacking on. So, AJ, would love to hear kind of like where you've been over the past couple of years. What brought you into Urbit, or what brought you into Web3, both if they were kind of different, if those were kind of two separate segments?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, yeah, I'm AJ, kind of finished up school for computer science about a year ago, started working in like the big tech, more of like aerospace related stuff, but just kind of had extra time on the side, was looking for projects and things that were interesting. I guess Web3 has been interesting to me for a while, partly as a place to make money, but also just kind of where the future like tech trends and places to innovate. So I think obviously Web3 has a lot of like developer adoption and lots of interesting stuff going on, but it still kind of feels like there's something missing from it that maybe isn't on like the AI or even kind of a lot of the recent like big tech stuff from Apple and Microsoft is all looking still like ahead of the game relative to kind of the crypto stuff. So kind of just figuring out like what's the missing piece for decentralization to kind of win that war against the big tech, or the kind of like Urbit, the way of calling it is megacorp. So yeah, that's kind of like the frame that I was in, to where there was like a piece I was looking for that would kind of serve that. And as soon as I saw Urbit, was a few weeks before the Assembly Miami conference last year, and I'm in Florida, so just decided to go check that out. Got to see kind of all the best pitches and best people and all stuff that's going on. The Urbit ecosystem, that's how I got kind of excited by it, and I've been kind of taught myself how to program in it, did some stuff there, and now I've been kind of, I guess, in the beginning, you kind of just accept everything an ecosystem is saying as far as this is the way we're doing things, this is the way we're going to succeed. But I think, obviously, I guess Urbit has been around for 10 to 20 years, so it's been like, in one sense, it has succeeded because most products don't make it that long, but in another sense, it hasn't, just because the growth rate has still been really flat compared to pretty much any Web3 ecosystem. So I've been trying to, I guess, bring like an outside perspective and push against a lot of the kind of like inner circle cult way of thinking about it, because you kind of get stuck in a mental loop if you're working on a project for, I guess I'm projecting a little bit here, but I'm assuming you get stuck in this is how we do things, this is how it's going to be, if you're working on a project for 5 or 10 years and there still is, maybe 5 or 10 years more to go before you're just getting some real adoption. So just been trying to find like the threads that will kind of allow the ecosystem to grow in the next 1 to 2 years. One of the ones I've been pushing for pretty hard is the self-hosted front ends. So if you've seen my Twitter, I've built like a self-hosted version of Uniswap, Gnosis Safe, and then Osmosis. So you can basically, after you download the application, then you're pretty much past, like, if Uniswap's front end got taken down, you can still use the version that you've installed on your Urbit. And also you might be able to get around some of the like Chinese firewall blocks. Kind of just, what are the narratives that Urbit are going to drive user adoption for Urbit in the next 1 or 2 years is what I've been trying to push for.
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't realize you had built those front ends yourself. I think that's like, obviously for those who are kind of in the weeds, I guess, like complementary nature of Urbit and crypto is a no-brainer almost, but you know, we haven't seen too much that's like user ready, I guess, there, except for the front ends. I remember when those were kind of making their rounds around Twitter not long ago, of being able to self-host your provider for, these supposedly decentralized applications. What was like when you first were like exposed to this, what kind of made it click for you, and how would you best like relay what you found most exciting at that early level to, I guess, someone who's like crypto native, maybe Urbit curious?
Yeah, so I guess kind of from the framework of like Urbit is the missing piece that Web3 needs to kind of grow and be successful. I guess most of my like philosophy around this I've actually stolen from another member of the Urbit community called Tim Luck Miptev, but I can link his Twitter. He had a lot of like threads, like Twitter threads a year ago that kind of what went through like from the base layer, like how is kind of like software been stuck in the last 20 to 30 years from a development perspective, because we're still trapped in the software as a service model where you have to have a separate account for every application you're using. They all have to protect that data, so they all have kind of they'll have to deal with their own deployment infrastructure and how do we authenticate users and how do we actually pay to run servers to serve them because our users aren't running servers. So you can't, there is no like me and my friends just want to build an application for us and have it run. Like the kind of bar for that has been way too high. So at least for my framing, I think probably Urbit's main drawing point is just a new like incentive structure for software. So if you can have users nodes that kind of serve as the backend for all the applications they're using, then you kind of hit like a permanent free tier from a developer perspective as far as, hey, this is just going to automatically scale. It's in theory. As more users come on, then there's more ability to kind of serve the applications and move the data. But I think another really interesting angle is the data composability and being able to own your data. So thinking about it from like the Uniswap perspective, Uniswap might be able to kind of use your browser's local storage to store some transaction information. But that's not really extensible in a way. It's not, that data isn't accessible by any other website or application. So if we're thinking if you have a Uniswap front end that's running with an Urbit connection on the back end, like you're able to trust that data you're storing to your Urbit is secure and easily extensible in the way that it's architected. So thinking about just, let's say it would dump all your trading history to kind of an Urbit backend, and any other application can permissionlessly jump in and say, hey, I want to actually aggregate my trades from 10 different front ends that are all storing it kind of in this table. And as soon as you have that happening, then you can just install another app and all of a sudden it has all your data, and it has all your data, but it's still secure. It's still just on your machine. So you could have kind of like aggregate trading histories and tax reporting and all this stuff that you wouldn't be able to get at all kind of in the current framework. Because if they are storing things, they have to store it on like the server side, kind of like behind all these systems. And even if they kind of build an API, it's probably not what you're looking for exactly versus just here's the data stored locally on your machine. And I think Apple kind of has like traces of this where you can hook into like a user's contacts and stuff and photos, but it hasn't really been built in like an extensible way where kind of these new sorts of integrations can emerge.
Right. Let's try and back up for a second real quick, just because I don't want to get too deep without, people kind of understanding where we're coming from. Can you give us, I guess, like your view of like what Urbit is from the ground up, and kind of how we're able to achieve those trade-offs that you just mentioned for stuff like Uniswap or, whatever other self-hosted application?
Yeah, for sure. So the innovation at the center of Urbit is instead of kind of you have your computer, right? But instead of it's kind of like going back to the desktop application model in a way, but those desktop applications can actually like act as kind of the browser would. So kind of the browser won like the computer model because it can access all these different websites and integrations and stuff that desktop applications at the time couldn't. So being able to have kind of a client side server basically, so it's only for you, but it can still talk to anyone else at any time versus just talking to like one company servers. I guess I'll try to swing back because I think I'm going too much in the weeds already. So the base layer innovation of Urbit is you have one identity that's linked just to you versus on a typical like web 2 type service, you have one account for one service, then you have to make another account for a different service. So you have one account, one like globally addressable name just to you, and that's backed by Ethereum. That's the Urbit ID system. And then so that's kind of the more further along innovation, more powerful, that you can kind of have the system where it's just one person, and you can verify that messages you receive from that person are signed by their private key. And there's ability to kind of keep growing that because there's up to 4 billion of these Urbit IDs that are kind of uniquely addressable. And then kind of what's been built to like show off the potential of Urbit ID is the Urbit OS. And now you actually have a personal server that will kind of use those public and private keys to sign messages and send them directly to other peers. And that's kind of where you start getting these abilities to deploy applications that are running all the time on user servers. So that's where if you're a developer, that's where your compute power is coming from. It's kind of idealistically a BitTorrent style protocol where everyone that's kind of using is also seeding the network. But I guess it also has the data kind of tied in directly to your system. So any application you're using can store data just on your machine in a way that other applications can hook in, request, and kind of build on top of directly.
Right. Yeah, it definitely helps. And I think it's also important to highlight that a big advantage, I guess, kind of that's being worked towards with regards to that is being able to have this self-hosting, have sovereignty over your data without sacrificing experience, without leading to additional complexity. Because I think in crypto, we see a lot of examples of decentralization leading to significantly worse user experience. Like, it's no secret that it's annoying to set up and maintain a wallet. And, I think that's something that we tend to take for granted in crypto. But if you've never seen this stuff before and you're trying to maintain custody of your assets, there's a bit of a learning curve there. But, part of Urbit's plan is to have that be a strength, I guess. What's kind of the path to getting there? Because obviously, Urbit isn't exactly user ready right now for most, at least for what it's potentially capable of. How is it that you can have something that's so powerful, self-hosted, and yet, the user doesn't have to know any of that, doesn't have to deal with any of that?
Yeah, so I think kind of this is where Urbit's like gotten stuck recently is they have kind of, I guess the kind of like ethos is we want everything to be tiny and diamond perfect, but that's kind of manifested itself as not building enough abstraction layers. And so there's one language that's used for the whole operating system, which is kind of very atypical because if you're building like a application on Linux or Mac, like the operating system itself is implemented in C, which is very low level code. And I think from my point of view, Hoon falls into that category. So you have a low level language that's kind of you're forced to use for higher level applications when you want like a more encompassing framework that's not worried about the last 1 to 2% optimizations. So it needs to break out and build more abstractions, which I think people are starting to recognize now. Like there's a talk about building other programming languages that could compile to kind of like Urbit's machine code that would be more high level and serve those use cases. So that's one thing. I think also kind of abstracting away the fact that this is a decentralized operating system is a good thing. And I think a lot of the companies have leaned into kind of promoting the fact that Urbit has all this weird terminology and, this is your planet and it's actually called a ship. And there's just a whole rabbit hole, which is like interesting if you're one of the few thousand people that's already gotten into it. Obviously, that's part of the draw. And it has worked to bring on the people that it has. But users want a completely different thing that kind of a eccentric developer wants. So abstracting away the fact, all the stuff where it's just like using Mac OS, I think is where the adoption is going. And I think kind of looking at some of the recent stuff that maybe Talon has done has been leaning into the fact that, apps are distributed by specific ships and they're leaning into the coolish stuff about Urbit versus abstracting away, which I'm not a fan of. So yes, right now I'm working as a part-time contractor for Holium, if you've seen them, but they're kind of ideologically aligned with me in the fact that we need to abstract this away and build the killer user experience. And there's still a long way to go there, but at least for my framing, it's the Urbit OS is like the North Star, is like this is where we want to be in 30 years. And it's probably not going to look much like it does right now, but you have to start with the current level to get to where you're going. But at least the analogy that I'm going to throw in here is kind of Nix OS versus the like Nix package manager. You familiar with those? So like the Nix package manager itself has like
Actually, just to end out, just to stop you there, if you don't mind, like clarifying that a little bit.
Nix is like a functional quote package manager. So it's the ability to like basically install like plugins and stuff for an application. So there's like Nix, the package manager, which is like kind of the core. And then people were like, hey, what if we took this innovation, we built like a whole like desktop kind of Linux competitor operating system out of it. And that's what Nix OS became. So I think there's kind of the same like duality there where Urbit ID is like the core, which I think already is like done and good enough to drive major user adoption to like that part of Urbit, technically speaking. But the operating system itself is just a way longer term project. And I think I've been kind of pushing against like don't build a company on a platform that's not mature yet, because you're basically multiplying the probability the project itself isn't going to be successful times the probability that your product itself on the platform isn't going to be successful. Like you don't want to innovate on the tools you're using and the product at the same time. So I think depending on what you're building, it is a good target to use the Urbit ID system and their way of having public and private keys in a way that's globally addressable. But I think the operating system itself still has some way to go, unless you're directly exploring like what are the benefits of using this platform, which I think companies like Uqbar are doing when they have a on and off chain programming environment that's specifically compiling to Urbit's programming language. So they're definitely exploring it. But I think like just hey, we're building a decentralized chat app that has, payment integrations and multiplayer. I think there's just more mature technologies that can be built out faster. And that's kind of what I'd be pushing for. Because what you want more people using the ID system to kind of drive up investment in the space. And then if you're, as a company, you're also making a bunch of money, then if you're ideologically aligned with Urbit, then you're able to go back and invest and kind of push it forward in a way that's going to help your product succeed. So I think that's the way that I frame it, to go around like the Urbit kind of cult center is we should get people using this, and that'll drive the resources to kind of get it built right. So you don't have to use Urbit as everything as your backend on day one. Let's just get off the ground and get going.
You mentioned Ukbar there for a second. I think that, at least as I understand it, Ukbar is a little bit, it's definitely more, I guess, synergistic or approachable for someone who's, I guess, deeper into the Ethereum ecosystem. Can you explain what Ukbar is, what some exciting use cases or synergies could lie in the future between Ukbar and, I guess, crypto or just blockchain in general as we know it today?
Yeah, so I guess I don't have the most complete Web3 background, so I'm probably not going to be their best spokesperson, but I'll take a shot at it. So kind of like the innovation of Ukbar is, how do we have like one programming environment that can handle like off-chain, just normal like off-chain interactions and coordination between a set of like decentralized peers or nodes. And those are the Urbit servers that the users are running when they want to use a like peer-to-peer blockchain-enabled application. So you have the off-chain state, and then you have the ability to just kind of directly call smart contracts. And these are written, the smart contracts are written in the same language. They store data in the exact same format, the kind of native Urbit format. So the thought is, once you get over the hurdle of programming on Urbit, then you pretty much get the ability to use the exact same interfaces you're already used to, but now you're just directly calling the blockchain. And Urbit as the operating system is handling the updates of nodes and how you negotiate those and kind of sending all the off-chain state between peers. So maybe the first manifestation of that, which they've already mostly built, is a peer-to-peer poker app. So you can kind of hook in, starts the game, everyone automatically buys into the smart contract when they start, and then you play, and then the winner gets the earnings at the end of it. But that's a really hard thing to negotiate between 10 different, basically 10 different users, unless you're running a centralized server that kind of acts as the proxy. So being able to remove that is one of the main benefits.
That's interesting. I just want to clarify a bit here because my knowledge on your bit is definitely way lower than Ollie's. I mean, I read a bit leading up to this, but just so I kind of have it clear, I have a very, like, I'm very stuck in the Web3 mindset where I also don't have a technical understanding, but almost like explaining like I'm five. What would be the main differences in how my usage of the web would change if I took what Urbit is today and kind of dove in completely? Because from what I understand, everything is rebuilt from like the ground up, from like the coding language to basically everything. And in the Web3 like blockchain world, everyone kind of understands the basics of a distributed ledger. Is there any, I'm trying to draw the comparison between a distributed ledger and what I think you're explaining, which is basically a distributed operating system. So if you're comparing like regular simple proof of work of like for a distributed ledger, do people that are running the Urbit OS, like you were saying that their compute power is taken from like is used, the local device compute power is basically used. I'm assuming that isn't incentivized in any way. Like, are there nodes online? Like, how many nodes are online? Are people like incentivized at all to keep their computer running in order to like facilitate things on the like with Urbit? I'm getting a little bit lost here.
Yeah, so I guess that's maybe has been like one of the difficulties of kind of like driving investment and stuff is there is a finite address space which are backed by NFTs, and there have been like the thoughts of, I guess at the high level, there's 256 galaxies, which are like the top level like DNS. So they handle kind of the routing between peers. If you haven't found another person's server what their IP address is, then you'll, as a planet, you'll ask your star, which asks a galaxy, and then the galaxy knows, which part of the subnet like does this message need to get passed through. So that kind of starts the connection where it goes down another galaxy, another star, and then so kind of similar to a turn server, I think. And after you negotiate the connection with another person's server, you know their IP address, and then when you're using Urbit, it's the innovation is like when you send a message on Urbit from me to you, then it just goes directly from me to you. Versus pretty much any other messaging application you use will have to be sent to a centralized service, and then it goes back down to that user. But since you're making the assumption that my node is a server which is always running, and your node is a server that's always running, then I can just send you.
When you say a server that's always running, like my computer literally has to stay running, or
Yeah, so it's usually, I guess, the kind of most typical way of using Urbit right now is you'll sign up for a DigitalOcean droplet or like a virtual server, and then you'll boot this Urbit in that virtual server, which is always running. And you can run Urbit like directly on your computer, but then when you shut down, then it's not receiving messages anymore, which can basically cause a lot of like lag and downtime when you boot it and it has to receive messages from days ago that are still being retried.
so there are people right now that are running hardware that just like stays on, almost like a Bitcoin miner almost. It's just constantly on, and that's what the operating system of Urbit uses.
Yeah, so there's actually a company called Native Planet, which will sell you like a computer that's specifically built to run like 4 or 5 Urbits, and you just leave it plugged in, and it's always handling those connections, managing those, like receiving updates for the like Urbit application, and manages all the memory and stuff for that.
Okay, and this previously, like the previous model, I guess, like you were saying, is just like a centralized server, and everyone just kind of taps into that whenever they need it. And with this, you basically have your own server in your house, whether it be your computer or this little hardware box that's constantly running.
Yeah, that's right.
that-
And I guess comparing it to a decentralized ledger would be you're opening up the ability to not use a blockchain for everything in global consensus. Like if I want to send you a message, I shouldn't have to post it on a blockchain, pay for gas, and then then you can decrypt it. But maybe in the future, it's like once on the chain, it's always on the chain. Then someone can decrypt it and has that message. But if I'm just sending you a message directly, then we both delete it. It only was seen by us, then it doesn't really exist anymore.
Okay, and then in terms of the main app that's built on it right now is the messaging one, right? That's where you see like those, I mean, they're on OpenSea, those like planets and ships and stuff like that. Those are basically the messaging platform that's built with Urbit OS.
Yeah, so the planets are kind of like your name, which you can also add a nickname, but that you're like, if you want to verify, is this the person I think I'm talking to, then you can just look at their planet name.
Address.
Yeah, it's basically a more readable form of like an Ethereum address. And that's
okay.
Yeah, and there's multiple messaging apps that are built on top of that have some basic integrations with other like Urbit applications, but it's mostly just a messaging platform right now.
Okay, and then one of the most interesting parts about what you can do with it to me is, and I feel like to a lot of people, are the hosting that you talked about and that you developed. I saw on your Twitter that Osmosis or Uniswap hosting. So can you explain how that works to someone who's like has zero technical skills? So in terms of like comparing it to it seems like it's the next step above messaging. So when you're running this, I'm assuming that you set up your own kind of Urbit system and kind of download this software to run this kind of personal front end. When you run that, nothing is leaving your server, if I'm that correct. You're just kind of in your own world almost, and still able to like interact with kind of the smart contracts in the blockchain. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, that's definitely like the long term where it's going. I guess the disclaimers or where it's not fully decentralized and what it can do better in the future is so you kind of start from, hey, here's like Uniswap is hosting the code for their front end on GitHub, and you can just go and download it and run it locally if you're more technically inclined. And also there's a lot of times there's like cores related issues from running the front end locally. So it definitely isn't. So there's like you can maybe do this yourself if you know how to use like GitHub and build stuff. But that's definitely not
You don't. It's not like consumer ready. I guess not like one click, 2-click thing. Because the first thing that comes to my mind, like, and I feel like a lot of people in the Web3 ecosystem. I also live in the U.S. and Maryland, and the major discussion or like quote unquote fear, although probably not totally real, but somewhat real, is like the whole kind of just like complete ban of access to these decentralized front end or decentralized protocol front end. If that were to happen like today, how feasible is like a Urbit front end? Because like, I'm just trying to grasp how far along like the usable technology is. Because I think the concept is very interesting and cool, and I want to use it, but I'm also not technical in the slightest. So I'm kind of just curious how I could use it like today.
Yeah, so I guess it both is and isn't far along. So I guess the kind of like installing code from GitHub and building it is like what you'd have to do right now if you didn't want to use like the centralized published front end. And I don't know if you've seen, I think it was called DAppNet, but there's another take on like a similar thing where you have like front ends hosted on IPFS and you install this like special application onto your computer that would be able to kind of access those. So this is kind of a similar thing there, but so it is far along in the fact that if you're on Urbit, which is still like really easy to get on for the most part, especially if you're working with like a existing hosting provider or service, and even if like the US kind of shut down some places, then those similar services would just pop up in other places. Then you set that up, which takes a minute or two, and then you're immediately on a screen with like an app grid that you can just search applications for. So you'd search you search for the planet that's hosting the application, and then you just immediately peer-to-peer would show up what applications this kind of publisher is providing. And then so if you search kind of like my planet name, you'd see Uniswap and Osmosis right there, and you can just click install. Takes about 30 seconds to a minute depending on internet speed, and then you have it installed on your machine and you can just use it. You can use a self-hosted version of Uniswap. Then I guess where it's not exactly all the way along, it's just the process of getting that code built in a way that Urbit understands is still kind of kludgy or not fully well thought out. So it took some time to get those existing applications built. But it's if there's a will, there's a way, and if there is kind of a need for that stuff to be built, then it quickly will be. But yeah, you can just download the Uniswap and make trades on it right now, and it's running on your server.
And the coding language itself, that's also built. That's not like that's built like a custom ground up kind of thing. It's like its own coding language, right?
Yeah, so it's all like completely from scratch. So if you think even down to like what is a processor usually talks in like instruction sets. So you have like x86 architecture or ARM. These processors each have like thousands of assembly language level instructions. So you're starting with extreme complexity at the very bottom of the stack, and then it kind of just grows into a massive web of more of that. So Urbit is like, what if we just the Urbit thesis is eventually you just have so much complexity where like the coders or the people can't manage it, or it just becomes a big ball of mud is how it was described. So they start from the very beginning, and instead of having thousands of the most basic level instructions, they just have I think 10 or 11 And then it's like, all right, we need a programming language that'll compile to just these 11 instructions. And that's where Hating was built. And then it kind of just goes up layers above that, whether that's networking and kind of like managing processes and stuff. So there are benefits and drawbacks to that.
Is it comparable to anything? Is like, for instance, like, I don't know anything about Solidity other than the fact that people that use Solidity say that it's like very annoying, it's like finicky, it's like a lot more open to kind of attack. Is Hoon kind of similar to any other language? Is it simple for developers to like, or coders to like pick up? Or is it like a year of kind of school just to kind of make anything on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely. I guess there's like the trade-off there that Solidity made is like, hey, let's make this kind of like look like JavaScript, basically, which is a language that most developers are already familiar with. So Solidity is definitely a lot easier to pick up, but it also has a lot more like surface area and attack vectors, which are a lot more of an issue when you're talking about like a smart contract programming language. And Urbit's kind of made like the opposite trade-off, where hey, this is like a hard language to learn, but it's very kind of small and contained and is less attackable. So I think Uqbar has like the right take on it, that it's like it's a good programming language and environment for blockchain applications and like managing state around those. And I think where like the programming language isn't going to find like product market fit is just for general use case applications where you probably want to use something that is already way more set in, like Rust or JavaScript.
Okay. And so like I think those are like the main questions that I had. Oh, actually, for decision making, I know that there is a Urbit foundation. Can you go into some depth into like how decision making happens and what role the foundation plays?
Yeah, so I guess going back a bit in history, a couple years ago there was no Urbit Foundation. There was a company called Talon, which basically they started building Urbit, and they spent 5 or 6 years just focusing on building Urbit, and then eventually it's like the ecosystem grows enough to where you don't want like a company that's trying to make money to be the main like driving force for actually building the operating system. So that's when they kind of spun off the Urbit Foundation, which I guess they're still a little bit involved with helping develop and push it forward. But the Urbit Foundation has taken a lot of that like development, and I think they're trying to emulate a lot of the stuff that the Ethereum Foundation did to be successful. Like they recently added kind of improvement proposals and have a system for going through those, and you can kind of make those and try to as push for what you want resources allocated to. So I think they obviously have a lot of say as far as like where the technical direction of the project's going, and then they have kind of advisors or some people on the board. And then there's also for like bigger decisions, I think usually there's the Galactic Senate, which will meet every once in a while. And they're kind of major stakeholders of the project in the way that they spent a lot of money or earned a galaxy by being a major contributor early on to the project. So they meet every once in a while to vote on like direction and what's being built.
Right. Yeah. I was looking into the Galactic Senate not long ago, and I found it difficult to. Well, I guess I don't think that it's really open for public discussion, but given that like if we go back to the Web3 comparison, most like more realized applications, if not all of them, have a visible governance structure where you can see the discussion going on. Obviously, there's always stuff going on behind the curtains, but for the most part, you can see proposal discussion, proposal voting, and implementation. Whereas with the Galactic Senate, it doesn't seem to be the case. Do you know if that's intended to be that way and it will continue to do so, or is that something that is kind of just for the time being, and over time the a higher level decision making will become a bit less opaque.
Yeah, so I think there definitely is intention to kind of bring things out into the light. That's guys has been like one of the problems with the Urbit ecosystem is the people that are on it just kind of want to stay on Urbit, message out of there. So it's like there is a problem where there's like more activity than it looks like if you're just kind of not using it, because most of the discussions and things related to it are happening on Urbit, which is like it's another one of those things that's like culturally cool, but also makes it kind of look like there's less things happening than there are. So I guess there recently has been kind of moves to like make the stuff that the Urbit Foundation is developing and their proposals and stuff more public. So they kind of meet. They have their stand-ups and meetings every morning in like a public place that you can just hop into and listen to and also ask questions. I haven't heard anything about I guess, yeah, you can also go and make proposals there as well. I haven't heard anything about the Galactic Senate coming like into more of a public forum. And I guess I'm not exactly sure kind of what they're meeting on if they're not like the technical stakeholders, they're more of like the financial stakeholders. So I'm not sure if they weigh in much on like the technical direction or it's just more like high level strategy stuff. But yeah, I haven't heard anything about them or their meetings publicly, but I think it could be an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, I definitely think so too. We're coming up on time here. I want to zoom out a little bit before we wrap up here. Working, being in crypto, I think that there's a lot of, obviously it's a very financially driven industry, but I think at least if you're around the right people, it can also be very much like an ethos and like big picture kind of driven industry. So I find it fun or even like productive sometimes to kind of think of these like pipe dream possibilities of like what it could be in like a fully developed and like realized state. And I think that you can do the same for Urbit, and that there's these far off use cases that while still like there's a lot of steps you have to take to get there, they're within the realm of possibility. So I'm wondering like what your like I guess like some of your pipe dream like use cases for Urbit would be. I guess like just to give an example, I think I read this from one of Course One's articles, but the idea that using Urbit, you'll one day be able to essentially one click deploy a sovereign ETH node or a Bitcoin node. You just download the application, input whatever information is needed, and all of a sudden you're contributing to Ethereum's consensus or Bitcoin's consensus. What are some ideas like that about Urbit that get you excited?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of those. That's kind of been like the main draw of the project, and I think it's hard to bet against a project like that that's been going on for 20 years and still has like just even better of a culture than they did when they started. So I guess it's kind of been like described by a lot of people as similar to like Bitcoin in 2013 or Ethereum in 2015 as like this is still early, but is like going in the right direction. And there was no like real competitors to those projects, and there isn't really a competitor to what we're trying to do. So I think that's enough of a reason to stay kind of keyed into what's happening. But as far as like pipe dream things that I want to see is, I think kind of like taking the benefit of, all right, now all your applications and all your data are just on your server, then you can have like a personal AI model that can do all these interesting things where it'd be like kind of like using an Apple product, but on steroids, where your AI like knows everything about you and you can train it to do exactly what you're looking for without you losing like the security of how all your data is kind of stored in someone else's server. So you'd be able to store things like your genomic data and medical stuff, and it can do all these things and make schedules for you. And even like if you have all your data in one system, then you can have, it's like the idea of a front end application that's like coded by hand is potentially going the way of the wayside, versus here, like what data are you wanting to see? Then we can use AI to just generate like front ends for data versus having to build them by hand. I guess it's all just kind of unlocks relating to the fact that all your data is in one system that's easily understandable to AI and also secure.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually hadn't considered that, being
Sorry,
able to
just
have.
a
Go ahead.
just a question on the privacy aspect. You mentioned a bit in the messaging example where we both kind of do we both see each other's IP in that example?
Yeah, so there, as part of like the discovery system that goes to the higher level nodes, it basically has both the Urbit nodes have to know like the IP addresses of who they're talking to, and that might be obviously like through a VPN or something different than just like your home IP address. So yeah, there's kind of like the high level thought of Urbit as like the most secure form of software, and that's what they're building it towards. That's where it's going to be in 10 years or sometime around then. But right now, it's definitely not secure. Besides the fact that it's not really big enough of an attack vector for people to be going after right now. But yeah, things
I
like
see.
having applications sandboxed and data encrypted and all these things, I think some have been implemented and some just haven't. Just trying to kind of drive the product forward a bit first.
Yeah. And this is probably like a pretty mid-curve question as well, but it's been like Urbit was started around the same time, if not before Bitcoin. What do you think has been, I mean, like the mid-curve question is like, you're saying 10 years from now, why do you think that it's taking this long or it's going to take that long for any like different kind of, I guess, advanced development? Also, we have Shadowy Supercoder who wants to join. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, I think so. Just help. Go and answer that question first.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess the reason it's taken so long is just kind of like looking at the scope of the projects. Like Bitcoin is a 5 or 10 page white paper that's like all just came up in one guy's mind, then was implemented, and it's pretty much from that point on. It's just how do we get people excited about this and want to like store their money in it, basically. So, or I guess Bitcoin also had the benefit of like being hyper financialized, where there's more incentive for early adopters to like actually kind of push this forward. So that's one of the things that Urbit has been missing is like there was like no real way to make a bunch of money off of buying it early, which you still can do and get into it if you think it's going in the right direction and make a lot of money that way. But it doesn't have like more financialized stuff like Ethereum staking, and it's not like directly a currency, it's more non-fungible. So that's kind of like one of the reasons, and also just the amount of time it takes to build even a normal operating system. Obviously, Mac OS, Windows, and Linux have both been decades long projects to get to where they are now, but they also still haven't even, they never targeted like how do we build a multiplayer operating system that can kind of negotiate connections between peers. Like they were all pre-internet operating systems. So I guess like the Urbit is like how do we rebuild the operating system, building in all the primitives that we're having to glue on top of like Linux and AWS. How do we get those back to like the personal level so we can have real decentralization while actually maintaining like the power of using internet enabled applications?
And so what has to happen in the next 10 years for like it to be fully fleshed out or to the adoption curve to kind of grow? Like obviously this is more of an opinion based question, but yeah, what do you think has to happen for that adoption to really start to kind of hit? Or is there like, because to me, most of these kinds of the meme in like crypto ethos is that like the dollar's inflating to zero and we need another currency, whatever, like the Bitcoin maxi talk is like Apple kind of their monopoly going sour, the catalyst, or like what exactly do you think is going to be like the main driver of adoption in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think that like Apple or Microsoft are going to kind of like completely drop the ball. Obviously, we're seeing like some kind of cracks forming in like the centralized model and like the current account system where it's like you have AI bots and spammers, and creating a Twitter account is fully free versus if you base an account system off of Urbit, then like your account has value because it's finite as part of like the Urbit ID system. So we're seeing things with like Reddit and Twitter where they're having like it's the recent like rate limiting stuff and bots, and so that's hinting at the way of like building software as a service where we have one server that's serving 100 million people and it's all under one system, and also like some of the bans. So there's like stuff on the edges that's kind of pointing in the direction of what Urbit is pushing for, but obviously that by itself isn't going to be enough to get it where it needs to go. So yeah, kind of from a technical side, I think the current people in Urbit are pushing forward in the right direction, and they're focusing on performance and all these things. I think there's maybe a lot of like sunk cost is like a risk in Urbit's development, is if there's just too much sunk cost and like this is the way we built it 5 or 10 years ago, as far as like this is the only programming language you can use. And so there's definitely like some cultish aspects of the center programming language, just because the people that came in and are working on it are just interested in it for that, versus how do we get this like market ready and drive adoption. So I think that's going to be pushed forward by companies. I think Bar's going to do a lot of great work, and then also I'm kind of like pushing for Holium on to bring in like more JavaScript and Rust to like the Urbit ID system. So how do we make this more viable in the next few months to a couple of years, and then you can obviously go back and invest in the operating system itself. But I think it's still going in the right direction, but there's still a lot of like risk of are the people working on it driving it in the right direction? Because it's not like Bitcoin where it was all done on day one and then it's just how do we like get people excited about this and using it. There's lots of decisions that still have to be made, and maybe decisions that have been made that need to be kind of remade. So I guess there's more risk in it, like there was in Ethereum. Like if they were going to push in the right direction, is this actually going to survive and stick around? But I think the kind of upside versus probability there is definitely in favor of it.
If you had to put a probability of success for like a global successful ecosystem with Urbit, what kind of number would you give that?
I guess it depends like what level of success we're talking about. It's part of Urbit isn't even that interesting necessarily unless it takes over a lot of the computing market, because it like one of the probabilities is it ends up like successful, like Linux is successful, where maybe a lot of people are kind of using it behind the scenes, but they don't really know what it is. And it's not like, and the creators of it aren't making a bunch of money. It's companies that are building on top of it. So there's kind of like different things, and you start getting the benefits of Urbit when everything you're using is kind of like running on it as the back end. Yeah, it's hard to put an exact number on it.
Where's your faith at?
Yeah, I guess it's like I think maybe there's some like draw to these big projects that are like, hey, we want someone else to figure out. We want like something to be perfect and someone else to figure it out for us. But at the end of the day, it's like you have to kind of get it working for your product and your deployments and stuff. And no one's going to save you on the product side. So I think that's been like some of the draw to Urbit is, hey, this is going to figure out the back end for us and networking and authentication and all this stuff, which obviously it's going that direction. I think it will at some point, but I think it's the wrong mentality to sit around and think like, all right, this is going to figure it out for me in 5 or 10 years. So I should just be building on it now, versus like pushing forward with what parts of it actually work, which is, at least for now, in my point of view, is mostly the ID system.
Yeah, I think you're kind of putting it close on time. I do want to hear what Shadowy Supercoder was interested in discussing. You want to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks. Hey, guys. I wanted to chime in earlier because I own a Galaxy and I want to touch on the previous topic. Galaxies don't discuss too much. Like we have a private group chat, but the most important action that we've taken since I've been a member is simply voting, or rather electing, the board of directors on the Urbit Foundation. So we do hold an internal vote, and today we have Brian Crane, William Ball, and Balaji. They are the three directors who have the power to hire and fire the executive director of the foundation, who is currently Josh. And yeah, we talk, but like AJ said, it's most people who own Galaxies are very financially invested in the project, but the important decisions are mostly made by the engineers working on the project, either at Tlon or the various companies, or primarily the Urbit Foundation.
That's helpful, actually. Thanks
Yeah,
for
thanks
that.
for that.
I don't think I've ever met anyone who owns a Galaxy before. Actually, just one last question before we wrap up here. If you don't mind me asking, how did you come to acquire one? What was your level of involvement like leading up to getting that and then post that?
Sure. I discovered the project in 2020, like summer 2020, just randomly through spending time on Twitter, and looked into the project. Couldn't sleep that night. Felt like my brain rewiring. Then I just spent like a few months reading the documentation, getting familiar with the system, and then eventually started joining some chats. I'll take a step back. I used to be an algo trader in crypto. I've been in crypto for a long time. So like I had some capital and I just started asking around. I wanted to see, where these things were for sale. I ended up buying one like on the secondary market, so to speak, from a longtime contributor. So we just made kind of like a private deal. And that was in early 21. So it was probably like maybe 6 months or 4, 5, 6 months after I discovered the project. And yeah, I've been a holder ever since.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that. Congrats on the acquisition, I guess. I'm sure it'll do well for you in the long run, lead to a lot of interesting opportunities. Cool. We're quite a bit over time here. So yeah, I guess we'll wrap up here. AJ, thanks so much for doing this, man. This was definitely super helpful for the both of us and hopefully for some people in the audience as well. Yeah, I mean, looking forward to kind of continuing to follow along and seeing how this stuff continues to develop, how it maybe some more Web3 synergies start to come out over time, and just, I guess, if like the true potential can be realized. So yeah, thanks, man.
And
Really
if you
appreciate
could
it.
just end it off giving the exact places people should go to if they're actually interested in your bit.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for being here at a good time, and obviously you can feel to reach out to me or kind of anyone else you've seen in the urban ecosystem. I think Twitter's definitely like the first easiest place to do that, and then the next step is just kind of getting on the network, and then you're able to get into more groups and have more discussions there. But definitely feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And yeah, I guess one of the posts that I have on my blog is like all the resources that I read and looked through when I was first getting into it. And I think that's still one of the most like aggregated places of interesting information about Urbit. So I would push to check that out. I think it's linked on my Twitter page, so I can also drop that directly in the chat.
Cool. Yeah, I think on your Twitter page is fine as people see you as one of the speakers on here. Cool. Yeah, we'll end that there. Thanks again, AJ. Hope you have a good rest of your day. And yeah,
Awesome. You too.
thanks everyone.